Chapter 1. Getting Started. So, you want to start composting? What better way to be good to the environment and have your own in-house science class all in one go? While it can be daunting to start your compost journey, there is no better time than now to start cultivating what many farmers and gardeners call black gold. This book will cover the basics of composting and the different types of composting, the benefits of composting, and even some compost history. Choosing a compost bin. The first thing you have to do when starting your compost journey is to choose your compost bin. Having a container will make composting much easier, less messy, and give you a chance to show off a little bit of your composting personality, as they come in a lot of bright colors or fun shapes. The enclosed or continuous compost bin. One of the most common types of compost bins is the enclosed or continuous bin. This bin does not have any special features and is often made of plastic, so it doesn't rot or rust. Plus, it keeps rodents and other pests out. Because it will usually have a lid, it can also be placed indoors or outdoors, with the added benefit of keeping any odors at bay. Some enclosed bins may even have a charcoal filter in the lid to reduce odors. Unpleasant smells become attached to the carbon pores and stay trapped in the filter, similar to how dust particles are trapped in a vacuum cleaner bag. The enclosed compost bins are more user-friendly bins because all you have to do is open it up, dump your compost in, and let it sit, although it does require mixing, which we will cover in later chapters. Some people call this kind of bin continuous because the organic waste is continuously added, no specific timeline, and will decompose with continuous help from the composter. Most people tend to have compost to dump once a week, but you can dump organic waste every day if that is what you prefer. Enclosed compost bins come in a wide range of sizes, and they can be as small as 1.5 gallons to as big as 115 gallons. The smaller enclosed containers are great for putting in the kitchen or somewhere in the house, whereas the bigger enclosed bins tend to fit better outdoors, perhaps in a garden or garage. Small containers are also great for people who like to put their compost in the freezer, which keeps it from smelling and kills off any pest eggs hidden in the organic material. Another benefit of a smaller enclosed compost bin is that it can also be used as a carrying container to bring your compost to a drop-off site, given that your city has an area. If you are using your enclosed bin to drop off compost, it might be a good idea to consider some compostable bags. Like how a trash bag is used to line a trash can, you can use a compostable bag to line your enclosed bin. Once you are ready to drop off the compost, you can just lift the bag out, tie it up, and drop it off. Just a note that this can work for personal use too. If you have a bigger compost bin outside but need a small container for inside, then you can use the smaller bin to drop off in the bigger bin outside, or wherever you decide to put it. The enclosed bin can be made of a variety of materials, the most common being recycled plastic. Plastic is sturdy and is better at keeping unpleasant smells at bay. Other enclosed bins are made out of wooden slats, which is more environmentally friendly because it is made out of natural materials, but it is pretty smelly and is not as good at keeping pests away. The wooden slats are suitable for allowing air to enter more easily, though. Other enclosed bins are made of metal, although this is less common. Metal can be harder to transport because it is heavier and it can get dented more easily than plastic or wood. Lastly, some bins are made of wire. The benefits to wire bins are that excess liquid can drain away much easier. More air can pass through the compost. Some downsides to the wire bin are that it does not keep smells out, and pests that are not good for composts, example given rats and mice, can more easily get into the compost. The worm bin. Similar to the enclosed bin is the worm bin, which is also covered and comes in a variety of sizes. The main difference between an enclosed bin and a worm bin is, of course, the addition of worms. Most worm bins will include worms with the purchase, or you can search around and buy them yourself. There are several good sites you can buy worms from. Just Google "buy worms for compost" and several options appear. Sometimes local farms or community gardens will have worms that you can have as well. Worms work around the clock to change organic waste into rich fertilizer. They can consume anywhere from 5 to 8 pounds of waste per week. Essentially, this rich fertilizer is worm poop. Worms will eat the organic waste. When their poop is mixed with the organic waste and other dry materials, it creates a rich compost material that you can use in your gardens, farms, or wherever else compost is needed. Caring for worms in a compost bin. Taking care of the worms is relatively simple, but will require some maintenance. The perfect temperature for worms is between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why it is essential to keep your worms out of extreme temperatures, such as direct sunlight and freezing weather. To start off, you need to make your compost bin comfy for your worms. This will be their new home, after all. The best way to create a pleasant environment is to mix food scraps with shredded paper. Newspaper also works well. If this environment starts to get wet and you see the liquid start to pool at the bottom of the bin, that means you need to add more shredded paper. Gently lifting the materials and adding paper adds air to the container, which will improve the drainage and make sure the bin doesn't get too damp. A couple of things to determine if your worms are happy. First, happy worms will reproduce. They can easily double their population every 90 days. Second, your compost bin should not smell bad. If your container smells, it means that there are more food scraps than the worms can keep up with eating. As long as you continue to add a healthy dose of shredded paper or other types of bedding, your bin should thrive. Checking on the container every 3 days is an excellent way to make sure things look, feel, and smell great. If you notice that your worms are dying off, you need to move the worms that are still alive to a new, clean bin. Replace their bedding with a neutral, dry material, such as newspaper, and check for any issues in the old container. Is it too moist? Too dry? How is the temperature? Once you have troubleshot what is going on, then you can return your worms to your old bin. Things to check for include temperature. It is very easy for worms to freeze or overheat. Ensure that you are maintaining a 55 to 70 degree Fahrenheit temperature, which can be monitored with a thermometer. Moisture. Make sure your bin has the right balance of moisture. If it is too wet, add more dry materials, such as paper, cloth, or toilet paper rolls. If it is too dry, try pouring some dechlorinated water into the bin. Remember that your container needs to have some kind of drain holes so moisture can get in and out. Light. Worms do not want a lot of light because their natural environment is underground in the darkness. Make sure that you keep your bin in a low-light place and that it is covered. Fresh air. This goes back to moisture, but having drainage holes is integral to the worm's health. Like any living creature, they need oxygen. Food. Your worms need to have food readily available. Otherwise, they start to eat their own poop. Regularly checking on your bin and adding food will prevent this. Space. If you add too much organic waste and things start to become compacted, your worms will not be comfortable and will stop eating through the bin. If you need to get a second bin to hold excess organic waste or worms, do so. While this is called a worm bin, you should not be alarmed if you start to see other organisms living inside your bin. This is a good sign and means that your bin is thriving. Some other creatures to look out for can include the following. Springtails are insects that are white, gray, or brown in color, and they have a spring-like organ that they use to jump forward. Pillbugs have an armored shell and roll up when threatened. They can shred and consume tough materials such as cellulose, thick, strong fiber found in fruits and vegetables, and lignans, another type of fiber that is found in crunchy vegetables and wood. Mites are typically the most visible as they are generally found on the surface of your bin. Potworms, which are white, thread-like worms. These organisms love moist environments, so if you see many of them, that means your worm bin is getting too wet. Fruit flies are annoying, but an essential part of your worm bin, as their larvae are important decomposers. Millipedes are worm-like creatures that have a bunch of legs and move around slowly in your bin. Centipedes are similar to millipedes, except they have pinchers. They are red in color and can harm worms, so if you see one, take it out. Molds and fungi can also make appearances in your bin. They feed on decaying organic matter and produce enzymes that break it down. The tumbler or batch bin. Another popular type of compost bin is the tumbler or batch bin. This bin is essentially a barrel that can be rotated or turned to keep the composting process going. Best results are usually seen when the tumbler is turned 2 to 3 times per week. Like the enclosed and worm bins, you can just dump your organic waste into the bin. But instead of using physical strength to mix the organic waste, the container does it for you. The breakdown process is still the same, but because you can tumble the organic waste, it introduces more oxygen into the mix, which speeds up the breakdown process. Similar to other bins, tumblers also come in a wide range of sizes, from small enough for apartment use to huge tumblers that are often shared collectively by a neighborhood. There are several different types of tumblers, and depending on how much physical strength you want to exert. The roll-around on the ground tumbler looks like a drum container, such as ones that hold toxic material, but it is hollow. The idea is that you put the organic waste inside and you aerate and mix everything by rolling the tumbler around on the ground. This can be done by pushing it, or if your tumbler is small enough, holding and shaking it. The rotate on a base tumbler is usually a vertical plastic container on a base that turns either clockwise or counterclockwise. The idea is that spinning the tumbler will mix everything up well enough to start the composting process. The rotate on a central axle tumbler is a tumbler that is placed horizontally on an axle, almost like a pig on a spit. The tumbler is then spun on the axle, mixing everything up. The cranked with a handle tumbler is similar to the rotate on a central axle tumbler, but it has a handle that you have to hold and rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. A few words of caution with the tumbler bin. Before turning it, make sure no people are standing close by. The container can actually knock them over or hit them, which is painful and can potentially be dangerous, especially for young children or elderly adults. The freestanding pile. Lastly, if you have a lot of space, you can completely forego the bin and just leave your compost in a heap or pile, also known as a freestanding pile. If you have the space and tools, you can dig a trench or hole to put scraps in, which keeps things a bit cleaner than just growing a pile of organic waste. With trench composting, you dump your waste into the trench or hole, cover it, and leave it. Ideally, the waste breaks down and turns into fertile, rich compost that feeds the surrounding area. Freestanding piles should be at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. This size is large enough for the pile to self-insulate and has the moisture and warmth that microorganisms need to successfully decompose. With freestanding piles, the overall process is much slower, primarily because the heat is not contained and is not regularly turned. If you want, you can purchase a pitchfork or big shovel to turn the mixture to make sure everything is breaking down and that airflow is going through. This helps the process along, although it does not improve the speed by much. The biggest downside to having a freestanding pile is that it is exposed to everything and everyone. If it rains or snows, you will have to make sure it is covered, ideally with a tarp, protected, and put in a shady spot. Also, make sure that it is not near any buildings because the leftover moisture and water can seep into building foundations or old piping. What if it starts to smell? Well, you better hope you live far away from your neighbor, or else you will hear from them. Indoor or outdoor? While the compost bin you choose will likely determine whether this will be indoors or outdoors, it's still important to think ahead as you will need to make special preparations for your compost space. Pros to keeping a bin indoors. All bins can be put indoors, save for freestanding compost piles. But continuous bins and worm bins tend to be the most common types of containers to be kept indoors. They have the potential to be quite smelly, so they are often kept in an isolated indoor place, such as a barn or garage. Keeping your bin indoors is excellent if you live in a city or do not have access to a lot of space, because the size of indoor bins tends to be smaller. Many people will keep their compost bin in the kitchen just because it is easier to dump the scraps that way. But an indoor bin can also easily be put in a garage, shed, or separate part of your house or building. Having the bin indoors also makes keeping an eye on the health of your container easier. You can check up on it without having to venture outside, great if you live in a city with seasons, and assess how things look. Suppose you notice that your bin is looking especially mushy or is drying out. In that case, the right materials are usually easily within reach. Think about being outside and realizing that you need to add more newspaper, for example. On a similar note, having the bin indoors makes it easier to turn or mix up your compost. You might not be able to use garden tools such as pitchforks and compost forks if you are wary of keeping them indoors or they are too big, but there are other options to choose from. An excellent turning tool that is likely to be in your home is a fork. While you may want to stay clear of forks with sentimental value or ones that are used for eating, metal forks work best as they are sturdier than plastic and tend to be better at grabbing waste from the bottom of your bin and bringing it back up. You can also use a small shovel, such as the ones children use at a beach, or a measuring cup. Lastly, keeping your bin indoors means that you do not have to weatherproof it. Extreme heat and extreme cold can affect the compost microbes, which can slow down the decomposition process. If it rains a lot, the excess water can get into the bin and make it too wet, which will turn your organic waste into a goopy, smelly mess. Additionally, if you have worms in your container, they are generally happiest at a temperature of 59 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything colder or hotter than this temperature range means the worms will slow down reproduction rates and eat less food. Cons to keep a bin indoors. Some cons to keeping your compost bin indoors are that it might smell and cause some tension with your significant other, roommates, or anyone else that shares your living space. This is not always the case, though. As mentioned before, some people have their compost in a separate indoor area, such as a shed or garage. If your compost bin does start to get really smelly, though, it is often a sign that the balance between wet and dry materials is off, or that you need to turn the compost to allow more oxygen throughout the bin. You can also try to line the container with a compostable bag and tie it up when you are not adding any waste to it. On a related note, keeping your compost bin indoors can also make you feel like you are limited in what you can put into the container. In the previous paragraph, I talked about how your bin can smell, and certain foods can be more pungent than others. Onions, garlic, and cruciferous vegetables can cause your container to smell unpleasant, especially when they start to decompose. Knowing that certain organic waste can cause your bin to smell worse can make you feel limited in composting. Lastly, keeping your compost bin indoors can mean your organic waste will take longer to break down because it is not exposed to the elements from outside. Having your container outdoors means that it is exposed to things that naturally jumpstart the decomposition process: sunlight, moisture, bacteria, micro and macroorganisms, and varying temperatures. With a bin that is kept indoors, you have to recreate all these elements artificially. There are compost accelerators that you can buy, but usually what your compost bin needs is a better combination of wet and dry material. For the lack of sunlight, you will have to make this up by turning your organic waste more frequently and placing your compost in a warm area. Under the sink works well for a lot of people. Pros to keeping a bin outdoors. Outdoor bins are definitely better if the smell is a concern for you. However, it does not mean that it will not smell. If your neighbors live close by, you might want to reconsider where you put your bin, since if it is right up against the neighbor's wall, things could get awkward. If you have a solid compost bin with a sturdy lid, though, by all means, you can keep it outdoors. Sometimes the smells can attract pests, but they are much easier to deal with in an outdoor setting rather than indoors. Outdoor bins are also better in terms of space. With an outdoor area, you can maintain a bigger container, which means more organic waste can be added to the bin, creating more compost for you to use. With a bigger-sized bin, compost breaks down faster and more efficiently because it can reach higher temperatures and maintain that temperature for longer than a smaller-sized container, a composting process known as hot composting. Lastly, we had talked about how a downside to keeping your bin indoors was that it was not exposed to the elements. With an outdoor container, all of these things are going to be at play. Sunlight can warm up your compost, which helps immensely with hot compost and can move the composting process along. Good bacteria and other compost organisms love heat and thrive in temperatures that can reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Psychrophiles, mesophiles, and thermophilic bacteria are all found in compost and help break down the organic waste while keeping the compost hot enough to kill off any dangerous pathogens. Cons to keeping your bin outdoors. Some cons of keeping your bin outdoors are that you need to protect it from unfavorable weather. We previously learned that extreme weather and rain can negatively affect your container, so keeping one outdoors will definitely require additional care and watchfulness. Winter will be tough on your compost because snow and freezing temperatures can cause the microbes to become dormant, much like animals that go into hibernation. Some simple tricks to help your compost in the winter include insulating the bin with layers of leaves, straw, cardboard, or sawdust to keep warmth in the pile. In addition to protecting your compost bin from weather, you will also have to keep in mind potential pests. The smells of food and waste can bring about unwelcome house guests such as rats, mice, cockroaches, and other critters. To make sure these animals do not get into your compost bin, you will have to make sure that your container is pest-proofed. Pest-proofing your compost bin includes taking several steps, such as thinking about the bin's location and strategizing based on the kind of pests you expect to come after your compost bin. You will not want to add pesticides or anything harmful to humans, as the compost will probably be used in a garden or to nurture edible plants. Give your compost bin walls and a covering. Make sure your compost bin has solid sides and a lid. Any holes or cracks mean that a pest could squeeze through. For example, rats can squeeze through gaps of just over ½ an inch wide. For smaller creatures such as cockroaches or any tiny creatures, there are special products that you can buy, such as sealant, to make sure that even the most minor cracks are taken care of. Put your bin in an open location. Most pets prefer dark spaces that are not out in the open, e.g. along fences in corners. If you put the bin somewhere that's more out in the open, pests are less likely to come to the container for fear of being spotted and attacked by a bigger predator. Put the compost bin in an area with a lot of foot traffic. Putting your compost bin somewhere you pass often will deter pests from getting into your container. Despite what some people might think, pests are not out to get you and make your life harder on purpose. They are going after food and shelter, so they are looking out for their own safety. If they feel like an area is dangerous, e.g. potentially predators constantly hanging around, they will be less likely to go to that area because of self-preservation. Lastly, a bin that is kept outdoors is probably going to be quite large and therefore not as easily portable as the indoor bins. I had previously mentioned that outdoor bins tend to be bigger because there is usually more space to work with outdoors, which is a plus. But then the downside is that it will be harder to move. Some people might try to use a cart or ask friends to help, but both would require a monetary cost or a time commitment. Hot versus cold composting. Depending on how quickly you want your compost to break down, it's worthwhile to think about temperature. Hot compost can typically heat up to temperatures of 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit when microbial activity is at its peak. On the other hand, cold compost can take 6 months or more to fully break down and probably will not get any hotter than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Pros to hot composting. One of the primary reasons people decide to make a hot compost pile is because it provides the fastest results when going from organic waste to finished compost. All organic matter is made up of units that are connected within the body. When these connections are exposed to high temperatures, they break apart. Very high temperatures are also when helpful microbes, remember the thermophilic bacteria from the previous section, are the most active and are reproducing and consuming waste at a very high rate. Consistently turning your pile ensures that oxygen will get into your compost pile, which in turn will make the microbes active again. If you are taking really great care of your hot compost, it is not uncommon to have finished compost that is ready to use within 3 to 4 weeks. High heat also kills off any harmful pathogens that can get into your compost pile, like molds, fungal infections, or bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. As long as your compost pile reaches temperatures in the 130 to 160 degree Fahrenheit range, you will not have to worry about these harmful organisms. Suppose you are adding animal manure to your compost. In that case, you should definitely be checking your compost to make sure that it is reaching optimal temperatures. This can be done using a compost thermometer. Some people are wary of catching something while turning their compost, so if it makes you feel safer, you can wear a mask. Lastly, hot composting allows you to compost items that you may have thrown away because you thought they were too tough to break down. This can include items such as twigs, branches, or fibrous materials like corn stalks. It will indeed take a while for things like these to fully break down, even in a hot compost bin, but they are more likely to decompose in a hot bin rather than a cold bin. Some hot compost bins are even able to break down man-made compostable materials like compostable utensils or plastic bags. Still, these are likely the commercial composting warehouses, which will be discussed later. Cons to hot composting. On the other hand, hot composting requires more physical work than a cold compost bin. You have to constantly turn the compost to keep it hot and the microbes active. If you end up not turning, even for a couple of weeks, this can completely stop the microbial process and significantly cool down the compost bin. Hot compost bins also fare much better when in the sun, so some people like to move their container to a sunny place or purchase a UV light to shine on the bin. Both of these require extra effort on the composter's part. Hot compost also requires more specialized equipment. Because you need to make sure your bin does not get too cold, many people like to buy a compost thermometer because then they can see when they need to start mixing their compost. The thermometer comes on a long metal stick, which you should ideally stick in the middle of the compost pile. If you are interested in helping the decomposition process even more, you might want to buy tools that break or chop the organic waste into smaller pieces. This includes handheld compost choppers, mulching mowers, shredders, and pruning shears. Smaller portions mean the microbes do not have to work as hard to break down the waste, thus making the breakdown process quicker. In the previous section, we learned that outdoor bins require more space. The same can be said for a hot compost bin. A lot of outdoor compost bins do use a hot composting process. Many experienced composters say that the minimum size for a hot compost bin to really thrive is a 4-foot by 5 to 6-foot space. Anything smaller than that can stifle oxygen flow, which is integral to heating up your pile. Likewise, if your compost bin is too big, you will not be able to properly reach and mix all parts of the container. Regardless of the size, hot compost bins will require more space than cold compost bins. Pros to cold composting. The opposite of hot composting is cold composting. Cold composting definitely requires less effort to maintain and can be thought of as an add-as-you-go pile. The goal of cold composting is not to reach an optimal temperature and keep it there. Instead, you are letting the decomposition process happen naturally. You will occasionally turn the organic waste, but this is usually to cover up wet or rotten material with the dry matter, so it does not smell, or to introduce oxygen within the compost. It is fine if your cold compost heats up a little, but it usually will not get to be hot enough to kill any bacteria or microbes. Cold composting is great for people that do not want to put a lot of effort into their compost piles, or do not have time to check temperatures and mix their compost. Have an hour to spare? You can turn your compost, and even if you cannot turn it again for another month, that is okay. Many people will add worms to their cold compost bin significantly because worms can help break organic waste down quicker, and they thrive in moderate temperatures. There are also a few beneficial fungi and bacteria that do better in mild temperatures rather than the 100+ degrees of a hot compost bin. This natural way of decomposing feels good to some people, as they liken it to the slow and steady way that Mother Earth creates compost. While hot composting takes up a lot of space, cold composting works wonderfully in a smaller area, especially small compost bins that can be kept in a house or apartment. It does not have to be turned often, so it is easy for someone to just keep throwing organic waste into their bin without having to worry about layering wet and dry materials or making sure the temperature is right. Worms can also feed easier in a smaller space, meaning that they can work more efficiently. Cons to cold composting. A con of cold composting is the fact that it takes forever to break down and produce usable compost. It can take several months before you can even see any compost, much less use it in your garden or yard. Aesthetically, this is not great, as seeing a bunch of rotting organic waste is not eye candy for anyone, and even if it is hidden away from prying eyes, it can feel like no progress has been made. Patience is a virtue, but it can be disheartening to not see much happening. You can try to speed up the process by turning the pile more frequently, but you might want to just consider hot composting if that is the case. On that point, though, cold composting does still require some turning, as the organic waste can end up sticking together and smelling. Another major con of cold composting is that it never gets hot enough to kill or break down harmful bacteria, microbes, or chemicals. If you are using pesticides or herbicides in your yard, it would be best not to add anything from the garden into your cold compost pile. For example, grass clippings are usually a great addition to compost, but in cold composting, any chemical residue will not be broken down because it is not hot enough. Weeds and diseased plants will also survive in cold compost piles. If you throw invasive weeds into your compost, you can be sure that they will appear again if you use the compost. Similarly, the diseased plants will not be killed off by the moderate temperature of a cold compost pile, so it is more likely to leach into the finished compost. Overall, a cold compost pile will provide less compost because the decomposition process takes so long. It is also harder to access the finished compost because it is more likely to be closer to the bin's bottom. Remember that there is less turning when cold composting. The decomposing will start at the bottom of the pile and work its way up. So when you are trying to grab this black gold, you will likely end up scooping out larger particles that still need to break down. Chapter Review. Before you get started on composting, you will need to choose a compost bin, decide if it's going to be placed indoors or outdoors, and determine whether your compost bin will be hot or cold. All of these choices will be influenced by your own personal preferences and living situation. Compost bins that maintain a high temperature and are mixed often will decompose the quickest, whereas cold compost that is not mixed often is the slowest to break down organic waste. The addition of worms to a compost bin will also help along the decomposition process, so if you are not able to turn the compost often or maintain a high temperature, worms can definitely make up for it. Just remember that there are pros and cons to all of these options, and it will be up to you to decide what works best with your lifestyle.